Everybody, it's James from RocketBlocks. Today we're joined by Matthew Calvert, a RocketBlocks expert and coach who's going to help us walk through a recent case that he's completed on the RocketBlocks YouTube channel. Matty is currently at Kairos Aerospace. He went to graduate school at Duke University and his experience at BCG. Matty, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm super excited to go through this case with you.
Yeah, James, I'm excited to be here and happy to talk about, I think, a really relevant case for what's going on in the world right now.
Awesome. Great. With that, let's dive in and take a look at some of your structuring.
And the way I want to think about this is really in three buckets. First is we want to quantify the benefits of possibly returning to office. This, is a tough decision. And we want to make sure that if we are going to move in this direction, that there are quantifiable benefits that outweigh the next bucket, which would be quantifying any costs. We want to make sure that this is going to be overall a net positive for the client. And then finally, we'd want to think through how we're going to implement this. I went from working a fully in-person job to a remote, to hybrid, and now back to a remote. And so I've experienced all of these, and it's a really big decision about how you're going to impact your employees' lives. And so we want to make sure that this is really handled thoughtfully because there will be some sort of fallout from it. So getting into the first bucket with a little bit more detail is quantifying the benefits. And I listed three things. First, how is this impacting our productivity? We have data that shows that our productivity is down 15% since we shifted to return remote work. So we want to think about whether this decline is due to remote work and whether returning to the office is actually going to increase our productivity. The next one that we talked about was collaboration. Our CEO has stated that in-person interaction can boost spontaneous idea generation and collaboration. And we want to look to other studies and maybe talking to some of our employees, other companies we've worked with to validate this and quantify its impact on productivity. And finally, we want to think through how this is going to impact our culture. Is returning to the office enhancing our company culture? Will it lead to greater employee satisfaction, retention, even attracting higher quality talent? Those are all potential benefits from this. However, these aren't without costs. The next one we talked about, we really got rid of a bunch of our office space. Our current capacity can only accommodate 40% of our employees. So ramping up office space is going to really increase our operating costs. That's one thing we're going to want to think about. The next one is dissatisfaction and churn. A lot of employees prefer current remote work because they can work from anywhere. And so we want to think about what the potential impact on employee satisfaction, retention is if people are forced to return to office. I know, myself included, a lot of folks have moved away from where they were originally hired for their job. And so having to move back to a city, probably they're not going to come back to the office. They're going to look for something new. So that's one thing for us to think about. And then finally, implementation. I think there's three things here. One is timing. So finding office space to accommodate for another 60% of our employees is going to take time. I know there's a lot of room in the market for offices. However, it's going to take time to build them out. We've had a lot of supply chain slowdowns. I think that's back in a better place now. But getting desks, monitors, all those things that you're going to need for our employees to really hit the ground running from day one, it's going to take some time. How do we want to think about team by team nuances? Whether you're on the product team or the sales team or the customer satisfaction team, these are all different and have sort of different structures, arrangements that they've probably worked out with their individual managers. And so we want to think through how is that going to, how are we going to handle those nuances? Are we going to create one blanket policy or are we going to have individualized things? And then finally is the communications and change management. I think this is going to really rub some folks the wrong way and others might be happy about it. And so we want to be really thoughtful and giving a clear, concise rationale for why we're doing this and how it's going to benefit our employees. So I think if I could start, I'd love to think.
And we're back. So Matty, nice job. I really like the structure that you came up with. I think this is, like you said, a super relevant question that many companies are actually facing today. For a case like this, one thing I wanted to ask you was, how do you think about customizing what might seem like a fairly off-the-shelf framework of like a cost-benefit analysis? We're going to look at what's good, what's bad, and things like that. How do you make that more nuanced or more custom to the specific case in question?
It's a good question, James. When I think about the framework, I think of this as an opportunity to really the whole case interview is an opportunity to show the interviewer how you think and what you're bringing to the table. And it's done within this structure of solving a case. And each piece is an aspect of you trying to show a different way that you think, some of your creativity, some of the experience that you bring to the table. So for this, it's really a cost benefit analysis. It's the same type of framework as, should we buy a business? Should we acquire a new technology? So for me, there was sort of two questions. There was a go versus no go. And then there was a, how do we implement this depending on that decision, or what are the implications of that decision? And so if I had said, I want to do a cost benefit analysis, that sounds like something that you picked up from a book, from your case class that, at business school, versus kind of using your own experience. And so I thought about, how is this going to benefit our company? What are the quantifiable benefits, as well as some of the, some of these things are you're not going to be able to necessarily put a hard number on, but you still want to go through the exercise of trying to put some sort of value on it, whether it's a 1 million, 10 million, 100 million type thing. And then from there, adding in some of the relevant context. Where have you worked before? What have you seen on the news? What have you read online? Bring in those pieces of information, because it shows the interviewer that you're able to think critically, that you're able to bring in separate pieces of information, and it sets you apart from other people.
Yeah, I like that approach a lot, where even if, it's, hey, we're looking at, what are the benefits or what are the costs, like bringing in your relevant expertise helps elevate it from some sort of like theoretical or academic exercise into, hey, if we were solving this problem for real, this is how I would approach it. This is how I would actually tackle this problem if we were faced with it in a live case. One other question on your structure here, and this is maybe a little bit beginner level, is how do you think about sharing, like, initially your top 3 categories or your top 3 buckets? Like, how do you think about laying out, here's the entire framework, versus what you did in your answer, which is you said, here's all of the top 3 buckets. And then you went back and said, okay, now within each of those, I'm going to give you a little bit more color, a little bit more depth. So like in terms of, okay, I've got my framework that I want to share. What are your thoughts on presenting that to the interviewer?
I think it's always great to give the interviewer a roadmap of where you're going to go. It's a little bit different with the sort of frameworking section, because you're sort of built in, a minute to 2 minutes to write down your thoughts. So you have more time to think. I do still think it's helpful to say, hey, James, these are the 3 categories I'm thinking about, and then to go into depth, because the interviewer is able to follow you without making it feel like you're rambling and just throwing out different ideas. I do think it's helpful later on in the case when you're brainstorming. It almost buys you some time. So if you get a brainstorm question and you can say, hey, here's the 3 categories I'm thinking about. And while you're walking through those 3 categories, you can also be thinking about some additional ideas to fill out those categories. So it can be kind of a strategic way of answering questions later on.
I like that a lot. The idea of like, hey, like here's, this is what's going to be in the 3rd category. And it's both like you're avoiding any sort of like suspense or mystery for the interviewer, and also giving you a half a beat to come up with additional items that might go in there. I think that's actually a really good example of just the sort of structured thinking and structured approach, which is I don't need to know exactly what the answer looks like when I investigate this part of the case, whether you're in an interview or in an actual project, but I do know that I'm going to have to get to that category and investigate it at a later point. And being able to like live sort of do that triage and put an investigation, say, I'm going to do that later, is sort of a good example, like just of in real time, the work that you might be doing on a consulting project. I like that a lot. Awesome.
Yeah.
So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the math and some of the quantitative work that you did on this case. So let's dive in and take a look at some of what you were able to do there.
Forces their return, and 25% of employees living within 50 miles of an office will leave the company if required to return to the office. Kind of just some of the points that you were actually making in your framework, which were spot on. So knowing that, can you estimate how many Ledger Logic employees might be at risk of attrition if the company decides to return to the office? And how might this cost Ledger Logic, in the long term?
Yep. Okay. So here I see the 4 teams, the number of employees that are on those teams, and then the percentage of those employees living within 50 miles of either of our 3 office locations, New York, San Francisco, and Nashville. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to calculate the number of employees that are within 50 miles, and then that'll give us one group that are at lower risk for attrition. All the employees that are outside of that 50 miles will be our group that's a higher risk of attrition. So the lower group, I'll calculate the number and then calculate the number that are at risk by multiplying those times the 25% risk. And then outside of 50 miles are going to be those further away at the 80% risk of attrition. Does that sound like the right approach?
Excellent. Let's do it.
Great. So for product and engineering, I have 50% of that 4,000, so 2,000 employees. For the sales team, 75% of the 3,000, so 2,250. For marketing, 40% of the 2,000, so 800. And then customer support, we have 80% times that 5,000, so that's 4,000. So 2,000, 2,250, 800, 4,000. It's about 9,000 employees that live within that 50-mile radius from an office, which means that of the 14,000 that are listed here, we have an initial 5,000 that are outside. So within 50 miles is 5,000, or sorry, within is 9,000 times 25%. So that's going to give us about 2,250 employees that are at risk of attrition. And then I have 5,000 employees outside of the 50 miles times 80% risk of attrition. So that gives me about 4,000. So total at risk is about 62,000, or a little more than 40% of the total employees on those teams are at risk of attrition. So I'd like to also quantify that just to make sure, 40% of your employees potentially leaving is a big number, but in terms of dollars and cents, I tend to think that it's about $10,000 to recruit and train each new employee. So 10,000 times that 6,000 number is about $60 million in potential costs from, returning to office, just in terms of, losing those people and having to hire and train those. And one thing I'd like to call out is, that's a sizable chunk of money, but that's not including the loss in productivity and institutional knowledge you have when people leave.
Yeah, no, I think.
And we're back. Maddie, really nice job on that. I thought you handled that super well. The first thing I noticed when reviewing was how well you did at just clearing the chart initially and just describing what the data was showing. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Like when you're faced with a new exhibit or some data or some math, how do you think about, sharing what you see with the interviewer and making sure you're on the same page?
Yeah, when I am casing and I see a new chart or a data table, something of that nature, I always try to basically confirm with the interviewer that we're looking at the same thing. It happens pretty infrequently, but every once in a while you'll get a chart or a table that you're totally unfamiliar with. And this can be a point of confusion. And honestly, if you don't clear it and sort of confirm with what you're seeing with the interviewer, you could be reading it totally wrong. And so part of this is just a casing strategy to make sure that you're not sort of taking a leap at a section of the case and not checking in with the interviewer, because really it should be a conversation with you leading, but confirming with the interviewer to make sure that you're seeing it correctly.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. And then the other thing I noticed with this bit of case math was it included a number of like intermediate steps, intermediate like working numbers. And, you had 4 rows on the chart with different, like splitting them all in half and coming up with different percentages. Do you have any tips or tricks for keeping all of those numbers like just kind of straight and organized as you're running through these calculations?
Yeah, when I started, and this was a RocketBlocks thing that I did a lot of the practice math, but I would use chart paper or graph paper, kind of like what you used in high school. And I was very diligent about having digits lining up. And I did that to help myself get faster. And I would lay out all of my math like it was an Excel table with zeros lined up, and making sure that I was adding horizontally and then going down a column and making sure I was clearing it that way. And so doing that and practicing in that way allowed me to get faster. It did feel like I was going back to the basics in the beginning, but I did find that to be a pretty useful tool.
I like that a lot. And then the final thing I noticed in this math section was when you finished the calculation, you came back and immediately went to the so what, the like, hey, like this is what these numbers mean. And I was wondering, how do you think through when you're doing case math and you're really down in the weeds, multiplying, the 25% of 9,000 or whatever it might be? How do you make time and space to come back up and identify that so what, the main takeaway of the work that you're doing?
One of the things I would always do, and I coach everybody that I work with on this, is before you do any math, tell yourself and the interviewer what you're going to do. So I'm going to calculate the number of people who might leave the company, how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to multiply, which percent live outside the radius, and then multiply that times an attrition rate, and then why I'm going to do that. So why am I doing this? Well, the reason I'm doing this is to try to figure out how many people are going to leave and then a cost for that. And by doing that before the math, it sets me up at the end to then figure out what my next step is. I think really often in the beginning of the case, beginning of casing, you start thinking about the math as, oh, I have to show them that I can figure out 1.7% of 9.6 billion. Every 50th case, you're going to get that. It's not very common. It's more like, how can you figure out this real business problem like the one that we're facing here? And how do you think? It's important to be able to be comfortable and quick with your math. That's clear, but very rarely in consulting work does a partner walk in and say, hey, James, I need you to figure out this obscure calculation. Everyone's got a calculator or computer in front of them. And so here you're thinking about, you set yourself up, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? How am I doing it? And then at the end, I remember, this is what I'm trying to figure out. One other thing I want to say is, and this might just be me, when I'm faced with cases that have fairly easy math, I tend to think that there's a missing step or underlying question.
Interesting.
So here, the math was not super difficult. They were pretty small numbers, pretty round numbers. And so I knew that I had to make the assumption of, okay, this is how many people are going to leave, but that doesn't answer this cost benefit analysis. This just gives me a number of people. I had to add an additional step of making an assumption of how much each person would cost to, replace, and then bring that up for the interviewer, and then multiply that number of people times that number.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And I think both parts of your answer are super valuable, especially if you're just starting out casing. I think the idea of like, hey, at the end of the day, like the computer is going to like do the math. Like that's, if you can do the multiplication, great. But the bigger thing is, do you understand what the machine looks like? There's some system that exists and this math informs that. And you need to be able to pull it apart and maneuver the different bits of information that you're going to get. And I think the big thing in addition to that firms are looking for is like, do you understand like what it means if this number goes up or down by 5%, and if this number goes up or down by 10%? And so when you finish that work in the calculation and you say, oh, it's $60 million, you're like, okay, A, that's a lot of money. But B, like even outside of that, this actually, if anything, undersells the dramatic impact of this particular cost. And I think the idea of like math as one way to show that is a really good lens to take on the overall casing process. I appreciate that.
For sure.
Awesome. Let's dive in and take a look at your final recommendation and synthesis.
The CEO is, en route. She'd, probably love to hear your final recommendation. What would you have to tell her?
Yeah, so I would recommend a slow, phased approach to returning to the office for Ledger Logic. The first reason is the costs are large. We said it would be an additional about $60 million per year in office costs. And it could be about $60 million in just recruiting and training new employees from the attrition that this causes. That's not including the loss of productivity and the loss of institutional knowledge. So those are really big. However, the numbers that we've calculated show that returning to the office has potentially high growth upside and could cancel those out in the first year. However, the numbers there are a little bit squishier. So we're less confident in those because it's a harder thing to quantify. So we'd want to do this phased approach to make sure that we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket and forcing something that might not have that same productive upside. And so by doing this slowly and maybe focusing on one office at a time will help us see really what the benefits are, as well as get some key learnings as we roll it out to the other 2 offices.
And we're back. All right, Maddie, I thought that was a super great recommendation to conclude the case. One thing I'm always struck by, and I think you did a great job on this particular case, is, we just did 20, 25 minutes of analysis, and here comes this final moment, and your answer is just so sharp and so on point. And I'm wondering, how do you get better at that? How do you practice and think through coming up with just like a really clear recommendation in that moment?
Yeah, so when I started, I actually did this for all of my interviews. I would have a stack of paper that I would bring into the interview, and my conclusion sheet was always basically set up ahead of time. So I had a line that was for my headline, that was my decision. I had a bullet point, which showed me I needed to add a supporting piece of information, usually bringing in some of my math. Then I had an R, which said, what is the risk here? And then a line for a next step. And so I had that preset up. And so even if I didn't write it out when I was delivering my final recommendation, I would have that sheet in front of me. And it was, sort of a training wheel that would show me, okay, decision, supporting piece of information, risk, and next step. The risk and the next step, I think, are important and can help set you apart because they show you're thinking about this in a more real world context. Even if you're not entirely sure what the next step is, you can always add that. It shows the interviewer that you're thinking ahead. But I did that, and that was really helpful as setting myself up for success. The other thing I would say is go back and do previous cases and see if you could basically create a more concise final recommendation. It's a skill, and it usually is it's always the last piece of casing that you're going to be doing. And so ending on a strong note is really important, just like it's important to, start with a strong framework and start the case strong.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It reminds me, I've heard another expert say something along the lines of, like, imagine that you just spent 25 minutes debating with friends, like, where you should go to dinner. At this moment, you should be able to say, like, okay, we're getting Italian food, like, get in the car. And it's just that easy. It's like, we had this whole debate. We talked about restaurants. We talked about options. The decision is made, and now we're going to make that action. And I think your framework, the sort of training wheel that you described, is a super sharp way for folks to get better at this particular step. Awesome. Well, Maddie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, both in this video and today in this debrief. Again, Maddie's available for coaching at RocketBlocks. The link should be available in the description down below. And for all of you out there who are practicing and getting ready for interviews, we hope you're having some fun casing. Thanks a lot, Maddie, and have a great day.